We are continuing, like Mike said, on our series of Runway to Resurrection. And this morning, my topic is on discipline. So before you start heading for the exits or tune me out, I just want you to give this topic a chance. You see, I can relate to having those similar feelings about discipline, because it brings up anxiety, right, inside of us, or feelings of inadequacy. It also brings to mind things like drill sergeants and financial restraint, brings back bad childhood memories of being in the corner and punished, or morning boot camp, or even salads. I never realized that salads could be such a hard thing until a few years ago, when our house church used to meet together and have a potluck before we went into our house church discussion. And I thought, you know what, we can do a little better and eat a little healthier than we are. So I thought that once a month, we would have a potluck that I labeled Salad Extravaganza. And we all brought salads to it. I thought it was fantastic. You got to taste all these different fruits and vegetable combinations, but apparently I was the only one in my house church who liked it. And one person actually said to me, you know, Tamara, you can't throw the word on the end of, like extravaganza, on the end of salad and expect that to be fun for us. I was like, oh. And then I found out that some people from my house church were going to Burger King and eating them there before they came to Salad Extravaganza. And that's kind of what discipline does to us. We kind of want to skirt it and go around it and not be a part of it. Whether it's self-imposed or imposed by others, we just try to avoid it. And we think, discipline is something for those type A personalities who are overachievers. They're trying to outrun some childhood trauma. And if these people, these type A people, could just relax, the world would be a much better place. But I want us to rethink discipline this morning for the simple reason that in order to be a disciple of Jesus, you have to have discipline in your life. And if we can learn to discipline ourselves to follow Christ and actually be his disciples, we will not find this weird kind of rigorous life. But what we will find is a life that brings us joy, a life that it can be fun, a life without all these seemingly tight restraints on us. No, we find joy when we become disciplined followers of Christ. And that is because we get so rooted in his love, and we start to change, we start to grow into those people that he has designed us to be. And when who you're designed to be lines up and is in unity with the way you act, that's where joy comes from. So this morning, instead of having a problem with the word discipline, maybe think of it as a path to joy. We are going to be reading a story from John 12 today about discipline. But before we get into it, I just want to give you some background on three characters that we're going to look at. The first two are sisters, Mary and Martha. They are friends of Jesus, and they're more famously known for one of their dinner parties that happened before our story we're studying today. In that dinner party, Martha is busy running around making all the preparations for the meal. She is cooking it, she's setting the table, she's doing everything. And her sister Mary is sitting at the feet of Jesus, and she's just listening to him. So Jesus is doing some teaching there. Mary is learning from him. Martha becomes very angry because she's doing all the work. So she pulls Jesus aside and says, "Can you get Mary in the kitchen helping me? Because I am doing all the work here." Jesus just turns to Martha and he says, "You know what? She has chosen what is better. Leave her alone." So that's the two sisters. We're also going to look at Judas. Now, there is a reason that Judas has never made the top 10 baby names in any year. And that is because Judas is the disciple who betrayed Jesus. He was one of the 12. He followed Jesus around, he heard his teachings, and he even taught and went out and taught others about Jesus. But Judas is the one who betrayed Jesus. And he led to Jesus' eventual arrest and murder. So with that background, let's get right into this story. I'm going to be reading from John 12, verses 1 to 8. It says, 6 days before the Passover ceremonies began, Jesus arrived in Bethany, the home of Lazarus, the man he had raised from the dead. A dinner was prepared in Jesus' honor. Martha served, and Lazarus sat at the table with him. Then Mary took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume made from essence of nard, and she anointed Jesus' feet with it and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with fragrance. But Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, the one who would betray him, said, "The perfume was worth a small fortune. It should have been sold and that money given to the poor." Not that he cared for the poor. He was a thief who was in charge of the disciples' funds, and he often took some for his own use. Jesus replied, "Leave her alone. She did it in preparation for my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but I will not be here with you much longer." One of the first things we notice in this story is where Martha happens to be. Right? She's in the kitchen again. In the background story I told you about, she was in the kitchen, and Jesus said, "It's better to sit at my feet and learn from me than be working so hard, being in the kitchen." Some of you might be thinking, what is wrong with this woman? She's told that sitting at Jesus' feet is more important, and here she is back in the kitchen. If the Son of God can't change her, what hope is there for this woman? And I think there's two things that could possibly be going on here. The first possibility is that Martha is a person who's learned from her mistakes. Maybe she had that confrontational talk with Jesus, and she analyzed and looked at her life and then mended it to line up with what he's calling her to. Often when we get told about our mistakes, we do a complete 180. You see this sometimes in parenting, right? The strict people who are raised in strict homes all of a sudden don't have any rules or regulations for their children. So if this happened to Martha, if she did a complete 180, she wouldn't be serving at all. But in our story, she is serving. So maybe what she did was she put serving in proper priority in her life. Maybe Martha puts God first in her life. And when you do that, serving comes out of you as a natural joy and a privilege to do. Since Martha is not mad at Mary in this story, that might be a safe assumption for us to make. But there's also possibility number 2, and that I think more of us can relate to. Maybe Martha's like many of us. After we have been specifically challenged by Jesus or maybe someone in our house church, we're able to change for a little while. But then all of a sudden we find ourselves right back where we started, and we don't know how exactly we got there. Could it be that Martha is finding herself in that place that we too often find ourselves, the place where we swore we would never go again? What's that place that you go to? What's your kitchen, so to say? The place that you swear you would never go to, but you keep somehow finding yourself back in that kitchen. For some of you, it might be anger. You swear that you're not going to go into that kitchen of anger again with your family. But after a tough day, after coming home and slamming your shin into your husband's sock drawer, which is again left open, you lose it on your family. And you realize that you've ruined relationships again. For some of us, our kitchen is addiction. We've tried over and over to stop doing that thing, but we keep ending up back in that kitchen. And we hate that kitchen. And you're wondering if you'll ever get out but it's seeming kind of hopeless because it's a cycle where you keep going back there. For some of us, it's pride. We felt convicted about being so harsh and critical and unforgiving. We want to give more grace to people, but our pride keeps us from it because we're so easily offended, and it's starting to ruin our relationship with God and with other people. Some of us, it may be idolatry, which means putting anything as first in your life before God. So we've committed to being a Christ follower, but when we have to make choices about our time or how to treat people or our money management, we make those choices all based on certain fears in our lives. And we don't think about Jesus much when we're making decisions. Our value comes from our accomplishments and not from our relationship with God. Whatever your kitchen is, you know what your kitchen is, that thing that you keep going back to. Don't you want to get out of it? I know I do. For me, my kitchen is busyness. It has a way of ruining my relationship with God and with other people. And it's been that way for far too long. I was raised in the church. I heard the stories of Mary and Martha lots. But the stories that you need to pay attention to, somehow we have a way of glossing over them. And that's what I did with this story. I thought, Martha's not really that bad. All she has is a good work ethic. We Germans love a good work ethic. And so I thought Martha was okay. But it wasn't until I started realizing that I wasn't very close with God. And I started realizing that things with my husband and my kids weren't where I wanted them. And so I realized I had to do something. I brought this prayer request to my house church, actually, and asked them to pray about my busyness. But the only thing was I was too busy to realize how many times I brought this prayer request to my house church. And so my friend prayed for me, and her prayer went something like this: God, it feels like we've been praying about this issue a lot for Tamara. Please give her the resolve to do something about it. And I wasn't offended at all, but it was like a divine wake-up call that I needed, because I thought, oh my goodness, she is right. I have been bringing this prayer request forward lots and doing nothing on my part about it. It's like I thought God was going to levitate me out of bed and bring me down my stairs to my Bible, which would be perfectly open to a scripture that was going to supernaturally help me through that day. And he was going to make my relationship with my husband and my kids just so much better, even though I wasn't home much, and when I was home, I wasn't present. It's humbling to realize what should have been so painfully obvious to me. I was in the kitchen of busyness a lot, and I wanted to get out. But how do you get out? I think that Mary has the answers for us. And so let's take a look at what she's doing. The first thing that she teaches us is what being a disciplined person means. She redefines what being a disciplined disciple looks like. Because if I were to ask you, which woman out of this story do you think is more disciplined, most of us would say Martha, right? Because she's the one who's getting up early. She's the one who's stoking the fire. There's no electricity to make these meals and these dinner arrangements that she's done. She's the one who's setting the table, making sure everything's prepared, making sure that the meal is kosher, and all those things. You get the feeling that if Mary were in charge, she wouldn't even realize that she had to start cooking until she heard someone's stomach growl. And then on top of that, she'd probably just serve some bacon to all her Jewish friends. Like, she just doesn't seem competent. But I think what we need to do is look again at this a little more closely and ask ourselves, what takes more discipline? To go with the flow of culture, or to be disciplined and self-aware enough that we intentionally act different? Martha ends up in the kitchen naturally, because in those days there were no other options for women. They were not well respected, and kitchen was the only place for them. Mary, on the other hand, has to deliberately choose her actions. In the first story where Jesus affirms her, she is sitting at his feet, which is another way of saying she was learning from him. In that era, women were not allowed to be educated. They were not valued, and nobody taught them. I even found a quote from this era in which a man says, I'd rather teach my farm animal than ever try to educate a woman. So it just wasn't done. So Mary being outside of the kitchen and sitting at Jesus' feet, getting an education, is totally bucking what the cultural norms were for that time. In the second story, we see Mary at Jesus' feet again, and she's pouring perfume all over his feet, washing them with this perfume. Now, washing feet in those days was quite a common practice because everyone wore sandals, so their feet got dusty. But it was always sort of a lower person who washed a more important person's feet. So a servant would wash master's feet. And then children would wash their father's feet. Wives would wash their husband's feet. Students would wash their rabbis or their teacher's feet. But as a general rule, a woman like Mary would not be expected to wash Jesus' feet because she was not his wife. And certainly people weren't going around washing feet with expensive perfume. This was something of extravagance. It was worshipful. But the response of Judas tells us how people would have viewed it. He viewed this as wasteful. So we have two scenes with Mary, and they're both countercultural. They're both intentionally chosen by her, both very bold for that time, both affirmed by Jesus as choices that disciplined disciples of his would make. Mary redefines discipline, I feel, in these instances. Discipline isn't necessarily the hard-working, responsible person who's slaving away joylessly. It's about making those choices that take us out of where culture would put us and putting us at the feet of Jesus, time and time again. And this will raise eyebrows. It can cause family strife, like we saw with Martha. It can cause accusations, like we saw with Judas. It will not make sense to anyone watching. This might be a good question to ask ourselves. When was the last time my discipline created tension or even confusion? When was the last time my disciplined devotion to Jesus was viewed by others as wasteful? Those are questions we need to be asking ourselves. Some things in today's society that would be considered wasteful are making time for your devotions with Jesus, reprioritizing your day so you have time to read your Bible, to pray, and to listen to him. Can you imagine someone calling and asking you out and you saying, sorry, that's my devotion time with God, and nothing gets scheduled over that? Another thing that would be considered wasteful in today's culture is making house church a priority once a week. This is not seen as something that should be a priority in our culture. Because culturally, the unexamined life is an okay thing. We keep ourselves very, very busy so we don't have to examine our life or our actions. And it's very acceptable in our culture to remain the same person year after year, to have the same anger problems, the same pride, the same lack of forgiveness problems over and over. But the life where you actually sit at Jesus' feet and examine your actions with a group of believers around you who are pouring into you is seen as a waste of time. Another discipline move is to reorganize your finances so that they can glorify God. We saw that that was countercultural in Mary's time, and it's still countercultural today. When Nathan and I tried to sell our house on the Crescent and move to the current home we live in today, I tried to explain our rationale for doing that to some people at cancer care I worked with. And you could see that they were wondering if we were moving to a place that was bigger and better. And I was saying, no, we're not doing that. And they asked, why are you moving then? And I said, because we want to give more money away. Well, if you ever want a way to just like stop the conversation, say that, because they were confused and they thought not that I was generous, but that I was stupid and that I was brainwashed. So whatever it is, whether it's time, money, or how we relate to people, the discipline to do it differently and counterculturally is what a disciple of Jesus needs to develop. Mary helped us understand that discipline looks different. And her countercultural choices are fueled by her love. Mary does these things, sitting at Jesus' feet, pouring perfume on them because of her love for him. Her love for him makes her reorganize and redo how she does relationship with him. It's a very disciplined way of doing it. We don't usually associate discipline and love together, but discipline needs to be fueled by love. Mary very clearly has a deep love for Jesus, and her desire to please him gives her the power to discipline herself against what would be considered culturally acceptable. What I love about this is who we get to see Mary becoming, what her reflexes are. Because Mary lives a life that is very sacrificial. If we think about it, she sacrificed her reputation, right? Because she was sitting at Jesus' feet learning from him when no woman was supposed to be educated. You can imagine the tongues wagging about that. She has the audacity to learn, that woman. And then she also sacrifices her reputation when she pours perfume on Jesus' feet. This is an amazing act of worship and love. But she was not supposed to be touching his feet. She was supposed to be in the kitchen. You can imagine the gossip that was centering around her there. So she's sacrificing her reputation. Not only that, she is sacrificing her time. Culture is saying, get in the kitchen, get working, get doing it over there. And Mary is saying, no, Jesus first. Jesus is my priority before working in the kitchen. So she sacrifices her time. And then she sacrifices her money. The perfume that she bought and poured on Jesus' feet cost a small fortune, as we saw. You don't just go out and buy something like that. You have to plan for it. And so Mary is sacrificing her reputation, her time, and her money for Jesus. And what I love is that in a few days, Jesus is going to go to the cross, and he is going to sacrifice his life because of his love for God. Isn't it interesting how his disciplined disciple mirrors his actions in her sacrifice? Her actions of sacrifice are almost like they're foreshadowing what's going to happen with Jesus. She doesn't have to wear that little plastic bracelet that says, "What would Jesus do?" She can trust what Mary's going to do because her reflexes have changed so much by her discipline. And that's the kind of person I want to be. So after my friend prayed for me in house church, I realized I needed to make some changes. So what I've done is my devotions happen first in my day. Work doesn't come before my devotions. My plans for the day don't start until after I've sat at Jesus' feet, read through my Bible, prayed, and listened to him. And it's amazing how that sets me up for the day and changes my perspective. One example happened just a few weeks ago where Soren really wanted me to go on this field trip with him at West Park School. They were all going to Rogers Hill. And I wanted to do it because I love my son. But I was kind of unsure about spending a whole day with grade 5 and 6 year grade 5 and grade 6 kids, because I thought they're going to be so excited and they're going to be wild, and it's just going to be loud, and I'm going to have to rein them in, and I just don't have the energy for this right now, was sort of my attitude. And then I found out that West Park got a bus, and they were going to be able to drive this bus, so I didn't have to drive. But Soren was so excited about me coming that he went and asked his teachers and said, you know what, my mom could still come if you want. And so he comes running back to me and he's like, Mom, you can come, there's room on the bus for you. And I'm like, oh, good, I'll go. But I get on this bus, and the first thing that's said to me is by this little grade 5 girl. She's like, Mrs. Weselake, come sit with me. Well, that just melted my heart. And then I got out there, and I got to talk to all these kids in the chalet before they were sliding down the hill, and I got to bandage up the faces of kids who scratched themselves and hurt themselves, and it was just lovely. And it was really fun. And then I went sliding with them, and it was absolutely amazing. They were like, Mrs. Weselake, watch me do this, watch me. Mrs. Weselake, you can go down the hill head first and you won't hurt yourself, you can do it. And there was that thing over and over again, and I was just having so much fun. It was like my discipline in the morning set me up, grounded me in God's love, so I was able to see how much He loved all these kids. And it was just fantastic. They were an amazing group of kids. At Rogers Hill, you have the option of taking a tow rope up the hill, but I decided I'm just going to walk because I want to pray over these kids. And I just want to thank them and thank God that He gave my son these friends. It was a wonderful thing, and I was set up for that by my discipline in the morning to experience these children in a different way, to experience them with the love that God does. And it wasn't positive thinking. It was God changing my reflexes and who I was. So that's the lesson that Mary teaches us. But there's the last character, and that is Judas, the one who betrayed Jesus. Notice how when Judas talks about Mary's great act of worship, of devotion, of discipline, of pouring this perfume on Jesus' feet, the first thing that comes out of his mouth is negative and condescending. He says that perfume could have been sold for a small fortune and the money given to the poor. I think probably the worst thing about this is how Judas uses religious jargon to minimize this great act of worship and love by Mary. Absolutely, Jesus cares for the poor, and He wants us to sacrifice them. That's not the question here. What the problem is here is someone who's undercutting another person. Someone who has such secret contempt for another person who is worshiping God. Someone who's diminishing another person's worship of God because in their mind or in their eyes, they're not worthy enough. Mary was just a woman, and she was probably getting way closer to Jesus than Judas ever did in all his years of following him around. The text actually tells us what is behind Judas's complaint. He's a thief, and he steals money from group funds. And now there's less to steal because Mary spent some on perfume. His private sin is causing him to judge a public display of worship. And I wonder if this isn't what happens in a lot of churches. Certain people get their noses out of joint about an issue, and then they use religious talk to legitimize it. Maybe underneath that complaint, there's something wrong. There's some private sin. Or maybe they're talking out of hurt, out of brokenness and shame, and making it sound like holiness. I'm sure many of us could think of someone who's been really negative or complaining, and we quickly realize that there's something deeper going on here. The issue isn't the church, the issue isn't the people, there's something else. But if we go down that route, we are taking the cultural route of looking at others rather than looking at ourselves. So let's be disciplined enough and countercultural enough to look at ourselves and ask, am I becoming like Judas? Because there's real potential, right? We saw how close Judas was to Jesus. All those years following him, learning from him, and yet his heart never changed. This means that you can be on the inner circle, meaning going to church every Sunday, and yet nothing happens that touches your heart or changes it. You have the kind of life that gets angry and negative when someone is getting into a closer relationship with Christ. And we can hold this air of superiority, as if that person has to apologize to you before they can get close to God, because what they're doing right now is just not right. So here's the question we need to ask ourselves. Am I becoming like Judas? In order to figure that out, you need to look for patterns of complaint, criticism, negativity in your life. Ask your house church. Ask people who you don't consider complainers if this describes you. I can definitely relate to this point. And it's embarrassing because just last month I was complaining about my church family. It was a tough month and I was doing that. The more embarrassing thing was when my friend took me aside and confronted me on that. Confronted me on my anger and my negativity and my complaints. And it was one of those conversations where you don't feel good. You want to be out of there. You're nervous, and I was hurting, not because they had done it in a mean or cruel way, but because it was so true. And I was caught red-handed, and I was embarrassed. And I could have twisted the Bible and made it seem like there was a righteousness to my complaint. I could have gone the Judas route and said, I'm just really, really worried about what is wrong here and I want to correct it. But you see, I've done that before. I've been in those places where I've tried to justify my actions. And all that does is it makes you a person who doesn't grow, who doesn't accept responsibility for their sin, and who becomes very hard-hearted. And I didn't want to be that person. So after they finished talking to me, I just sat there and I processed what they had said. And it hurt, and I was embarrassed. It was utterly unflattering, but yet so true, what they had said to me. But I was preparing for this sermon, and so I had Mary on the brain. And I went off and I sat at Jesus' feet and I prayed to him, because deep down I knew everything was true, but deep down I knew I don't want to be this disciple of Judas. I want to be a disciple of Jesus. And so I have to go to those places where God can actually change my mind. So I sat at Jesus' feet. I prayed for God to forgive me, to change and take away the spirit of negativity that was in me, and to not allow me to become a hard-hearted person. I also did some soul talk, which is what me and the Kids Min team is learning about in a book where Dallas Willard says, when you're angry, talk to your soul, because that's what connects you with God, and that's what controls your mind and your heart and your body. And so I tried that. I said in my quiet time, why so angry, oh my soul? And the answer I got back was, you're having a problem with pride here. Ouch. That was painful to hear, and that was my secret sin. That was my Judas moment. And so I just asked for forgiveness, and I sat at Jesus' feet And it was hard, but this is where good things happen. Because when I heard about my pride issue, it wasn't like, this is impossible and you will never get out of this. It was so covered in grace and in love. And there was a hope that this is going to change. That's what we learn about ourselves when we sit at Jesus' feet. It's hard, but it's good. So the next day I went back to the person who had confronted me and I said, thank you for doing that. Please never stop. Keep telling me the truth. And when I look at this whole process of discipline, it's hard and it doesn't happen overnight. But we need to do it in order that we stop going back to that kitchen. We need to do it so we don't become these hard-hearted people. We need to put discipline in our lives so that we become the people who constantly are going to the feet of Jesus and learning who we are. Let's stand and sing. You know, when I was preparing for this sermon a few months ago, you can go ahead and have a seat. I was trying to figure out what this text was talking about, and I was going in the areas of like repentance, sin, maybe just worship. What is this text about? And then it was as I was sleeping that I was woken up and I heard this text is about discipline. And the points came to me in my sleep. And so I decided to follow that route. But it's funny, when you're talking about discipline, you have to look at your own life and see if you have a life that actually has integrity, where you are doing disciplined things that were pointed out to me in that text. And I found I had to make some changes. And so today, I'm going to call the prayer team forward, and they're going to be up here, and they can pray with you if anything from this sermon has touched you or you feel that you want to pray about something from your life. But there are some of us in here who just really, really need to sit at Jesus' feet. And so we have put mats down on the floor, and I am going to invite you to spend some time just talking to him and listening to him here on these mats. Culture dictates that we run out of here, right? Culture dictates that we think about this sermon maybe to Monday, maybe Tuesday is pushing it. But I'm inviting you to come forward and to sit at Jesus' feet and talk with him about those things that make you end up in the kitchen. Talk with him about those things that make you hard-hearted. Talk about maybe how you aren't understanding his love for you and you want to have that kind of love like Mary does. So I'm going to invite you to come and pray with the prayer team or come sit with me down here just as Jesus' feet. Have a great Sunday.